So a very good afternoon to all our viewers today. Today we have with us a very erudite and distinguished person. He earned his BA honors from University of Pennsylvania, an MBA from Harvard University. He's a co-chairman of the Confederation of Indian Industry Task Force on Agri Startups and a member of Governing Council of the Maharashtra State Innovation Society. Under his leadership, 30 startups in the agritech have been backed up since 2011. He manages a fund of about 9.35 billion crore rupees. We would all like to welcome Mr. Mark Kahn, Managing Partner Omnivore. Welcome on our show, Mark.
Thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure. We always love working with the ecosystem, and you're doing tremendous work. So happy to be participating. Where are you dialing in from?
I'm in Goa.
Nice, good call. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. You are an icon for all the people who want to get into impact investment, and also the present set of investors who are trying to understand what impact investment is. You are in this space for more than a decade. How has your experience been, and what does it mean to be an impact investor in India?
Well, how has my experience been? It used to be a lot harder than it is now. So I think in general, impact and non-impact private capital markets have seen a massive surge of liquidity over the last few years, and things that were previously very peripheral or marginal from an impact from an investing perspective, that were areas of impact focus, whether it's agritech or edtech or health tech, I think really in the last couple of years have become much more mainstream. That is both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because these companies are able to scale much larger than they ever were. Sometimes it's a bad thing because the impact focus can go for a bit of a toss, which thankfully in our portfolios has not been the case. In our portfolio companies has not been the case. But it's a marathon, not a sprint. I started Omnivore when I was 32 and I'm 43 now, and it's been a decent chunk of my life spent on this, and we still think it's early innings, but it's been a slog, and we've helped to build this ecosystem, mainstream agritech, get global investors interested in it, but there's no question it's definitely not easy. But it's been very worthwhile, and we've seen our portfolio companies go from being small and well-meaning to large and impactful in that time, and that's I think very exciting. So pretty happy about it. What can I talk about today? What are you interested in?
We are interested in entrepreneurship, impact investment, KPIs before you take a call.
In the form of questions, what are you interested in? It's
all of them and more. So some of them that would be of key interest to us is, what are the KPIs that you look before you take a call on impact investment, vis-a-vis for a mainstream investor? What are the things that you would look? Because social impact is not much measurable. So what are your KPIs?
So our KPIs, which are on our website, and you can download them and see them on the impact section. We have about a dozen of them that we look at. We look at things like farmer reach. We look at economic value creation for farmers. We look at hectares converted to sustainable agriculture, environmental KPIs like greenhouse gas reduction, reduction in usage of natural resources, lots of things, bluntly. Financing for farmers, insurance for farmers. It's incredibly transparent, which is how we like it. But most of the time when we're investing, it's quite early in the life of a company, and consequently, you're looking at something where the KPIs are futuristic, and as a result, you're mostly evaluating at an early stage, the same way any venture investor would. What I shorthand as calling the four T's: team, TAM, tech, and traction. Team being, is this a world-class team that can build a large company? TAM, is this problem big enough to use the jet fuel that is venture capital as opposed to, needing a bank loan? Um, Tech, is the offering differentiated? Is there IP? Is there any defensibility for what they're building? And finally, traction, which is it's subjective and stage relevant, but for the amount they've raised so far, for the resources they have, how far along are they? And you're always trying to look for outliers there. Dehat was an example of that, where when we backed Dehat, they were doing 40 crore of revenue, but they had done it with 1 crore of investment. And so, that was a really good sign for how lean and scrappy and aggressive they were. And so that became, a really good outlier from a traction perspective. So that's the way any VC will evaluate a deal. I think from our perspective, we have a theory of change that dictates whether we do a deal or not, and it has to flow through that theory of change. That theory of change is that we look for portfolio companies and investments that are fundamentally trying to transform Indian agriculture and food systems, and largely working through the 4 pillars that we look at, which is increasing farmer profitability, raising farmer resilience, improving ag sustainability, and catalyzing climate action. So if we don't see a plan that is going in the future to tackle some mix of those 4 areas, and with intentionality, then it's not for us. Then it's probably for some other kind of investor. And that's, in that sense, we have a very aggressive impact filter up front. Then once it's through that filter, we're evaluating it the way any VC would evaluate an early stage company. And then we apply metrics, both with respect to projecting what the company will do from an impact perspective, and then regularly tracking and monitoring its progress along those metrics.
That's very interesting for the entrepreneurs out there to know about this. Now, Mark, your prime focus has been on agriculture-based ventures. India is a very agrarian economy. In fact, even now, most of our GDP comes from the same industry. Recently, there have been many policy level changes back and forth and withdrawn. What are your thoughts on how would it be turning for the agri-tech industry?
Look, I mean, we can debate the farm laws for hours, and have. But the reality is, the effect of the rollback is nil, because the effect of the farm laws were nil, because they were never actually implemented. So, it's basically like being, saying that one morning someone gave you a gold bar, took it away from you 2 minutes later, and then said, "How does this impact your life?" It didn't. For 2 minutes, I held on to a gold bar. So I don't think it's fundamentally changed the trajectory of agritech. I think it could have possibly been beneficial, but it's very clear that there was a lot of social resistance to it. In some cases for very good reasons, in some cases for rank politics. It's the same people that opposed this initiated these reforms when they were in power. So there's a tremendous, amount of cynicism that kind of comes into the political calculus here. And that's fine. That's what democratic politics is. And, no one can pretend that this was passed after incredible amounts of deliberation. It wasn't. But there was 20 years of policy debate about this, where both parties, both coalitions, had decided that these were roughly the reforms they wanted. And maybe not in exactly this form, but along these lines. And so it's very cynical for either party, which, by the way, both parties do this all the time, to suddenly flip a position, right, that they had earlier advocated vociferously. So, politics is politics.
I totally reckon with you. Now, India's prime income, as we earlier mentioned, is from the agricultural sector. Still, 194 million Indians go hungry every day, and we generate 350 million tons of agricultural waste every year. Do you have any set of entrepreneurs who are trying to deal with this issue, who are addressing this challenge?
Sorry, entrepreneurs trying to deal with what issue? The connection got a
with
bit
the
fuzzy.
with the agriculture waste management?
Um, we are evaluating currently some companies that are looking at value streams from agricultural waste. We don't currently have any large bets in that space right now.
I see. Over to my next question is climate change is a burning issue on our planet. Do you see or foresee that entrepreneurs from the agri-tech space can introduce certain innovations to curb this?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I think the overlap between the agritech and the climate thesis is 80%. 20% of India's emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are from agriculture, largely from three areas: rice cultivation, our 300 million head of cattle, and overuse of fertilizers. So there's a big opportunity from a mitigation perspective to try to reduce India's greenhouse gas footprint, by tackling part of it through sustainable ag. And I think, obviously, India is incredibly vulnerable to climate change, right? It's this is not Russia, it's not Alaska, it's not Canada. Climate change is going to make agriculture in India much more difficult, unbearably so at some times of the year, and in some parts of India. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for agri-tech entrepreneurs to work on resilience and adaptation. How do we make this agricultural system able to withstand climate change, which is coming whether we want it or not, because the world can't get their shit together. So I think it's going to become, I think the climate centricity of agri-tech is increasing every year. And we're seeing more and more startups that are saying, okay, how do we solve rising abiotic stresses, rising biotic stresses? How do we deal with the fact that increasingly working outside in the hottest months is going to be unviable? How do we climate proof Indian ag with protected cultivation and controlled environment agriculture and other approaches? So there's definitely a lot of work to do.
Definitely. So since you mentioned that there is a lot of work to do, what kind of innovations do you see that entrepreneurs in this space should introduce to tackle this in times to come and presently? Some of the main challenges that we should address.
Look, I mean, again, you go from the framework of whether you want to tackle mitigation or adaptation resilience. If it's mitigation, as I said, the three big issues to tackle are the methane emissions from the 30 crore cattle, fertilizer and rice. Those are the three big ones. That really is what drives our emissions. And then from a resilience adaptation perspective, right, you can kind of break it down to biotic and abiotic risk.
All right, that sounds great. From my side, this is last but not the least question. We are a training institution to develop responsible business leadership. What kind of interventions would you see business leaders to adopt in the agri-tech space?
What kind of interventions do business leaders need to adopt?
Yeah, like in the supply chain, what kind of interventions can they bring in?
Look, I mean, every aspect of Indian agriculture can be made more efficient, but also more sustainable and more fair. So there are digital interventions, right, into into the way the supply chain works. There's changing the terms of trade for farmers by disintermediating the various points in the supply chain. There's building farm to consumer brands. It's like asking me how many different ways are there to go from Chennai to Punjab. Lots. They're all north, but there's lots of different ways to get there.
All right. I highly appreciate your answers. We have some of our fellow panelists who have some questions. Sandeep, may I request you to come in?
Hi, Mark. Thank you for fascinating talk. I have three questions, if you don't mind.
Three?
Short. Three. So my first question is, what kind of turnover should a farmers collective have before they start raising money? I mean, I know a few farmers collectives in rural India who are trying to grow, and I'm asking this question for them.
Look, if you're talking about an FPO, Farmer Producers Organization, there really isn't a tremendous amount of commercial capital from an equity perspective that's going into FPOs. It's a unique structure. I think in general, it's not really well suited to impact investing or venture capital. I think what needs to be made available, which is to some extent, are commercial loans at essentially preferred priority sector interest rates to enable FPOs to scale, which is NABARD's priority and the priority of other intermediaries in the sector. If you ask me how big it should be, I mean, it just depends how big the loan is. But if you ask me, does it make any sense for an equity perspective, from an equity investment perspective, probably not at this point. Yeah, I mean, that would be my view. What are your other two questions?
You briefly mentioned about the farm laws failing because of politics and also because of non-participative nature of the passing of the laws. What do you think are the key policy reforms needed in the Indian agriculture sector to create more wealth for smaller farmers and farm workers?
Look, I mean, to create, when you say smaller farmers, let's be clear, the farmers protesting in Delhi were not small farmers. They were among the wealthiest, largest farmers in the country. Anyone who thinks otherwise is deluding themselves. The reality is, many decades ago, we created a system in Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP that encouraged, that, to be clear, provided the food security of India for 4 decades. And that system was a system of intensive use of irrigation, intensive use of fertilizer, and public sector procurement of grains for the FCI at subsidized, at artificially inflated, politically set prices. That's fine. That is a democracy's right to choose to do that. Okay? And that system, to be clear, moved India out of a ship-to-mouth existence, which it had in the 1960s, into grain surpluses. The problem is, we don't need as much grain as we produce anymore. We went from having the classic problem of the global South in the 50s and 60s and 70s of, oh my God, how do we feed ourselves? To having the classic problem of the global North, actually, which is, what the hell do we do with these surpluses? And the answer in India is, we take those surpluses, we put them in insufficient infrastructure where about a third of them get eaten by rats or stolen, and are then distributed to a PDS where maybe 10 or 20 paisa on the rupee go to the intended recipient. And that is the system that we're defending and protecting. So if you ask me, and by the way, the farmers in that system, okay, the 6% of farmers in India that receive MSP are not the small farmers of India. The small farmers of India, right, are growing horticulture in Chhattisgarh, okay? They're not growing rice and wheat in Punjab. Imaginable. So it's an absolute misnomer to say, okay, how do we, this system is so unfair, what should we do for small farmers? The answer is, we don't do much for small farmers, but this system largely benefits large farmers. The farmers that took months and months off to go to Delhi were largely large farmers. That was because that's how they could do that, because they had farm laborers back home who were watching their farms. So I think the reality is, if you want to talk about, okay, if we're setting the farm laws aside, right? Because to be clear, not saying it was a good democratic process, it wasn't. But if we want to set them aside and say what actually works, let's start with a couple things. Number one, people should have a clear title to their land. That title should be completely digitized and completely transparent. And the borders of their land should be entirely fixed and settled. About 15% of the land in India is contested neighbor to neighbor, right? Which makes digitizing land ownership very difficult. That needs to be the first battle in the war, okay? Where every farmer can say, I own this without contest, and therefore people know that this is mine. And that then frees up credit. It also then allows for the separation of I own this land from I cultivate this land. That then allows people to lease land without fear of it being expropriated from them, right? Without having to do it in a semi-legal fashion where they put themselves at risk. But then it decouples subsidies that go to a landowner from subsidies that should go to a tiller, right? You should not get a subsidy just because you own a land if someone else is actually farming it. And so first layer is we got to get the land right. Then above that, we need to build a data layer where we understand who is owning something versus who is actually using that land for agriculture. If we can get that right, then we can fix a lot of these issues with subsidies and actually move towards a system where instead of artificially inflating or sort of artificially subsidizing inputs and then artificially inflating outputs, which largely benefits the largest farmers who can work that system, we actually decouple that and say, cool, inputs cost what they cost, outputs get what they get. And if we want to deliver farm welfare to you, we will do so as a welfare program, which is how we should do it. It should not be that we're using price to determine welfare. It's a freaking Rube Goldberg approach to delivering farm welfare that then perverts what people grow. It has people destroy the water table in Punjab, right? Destroy the North Indian water table so we can produce rice that nobody wants that goes into a PDS system where it gets eaten by rats, as opposed to, cool, grow whatever you want, okay? Pay for the inputs that you want. But because you are a farmer and we deem that that is important, we will provide you a per hectare subsidy that is flat, that can support whatever you want to do with it. But nobody wants it.
Yeah, that's very useful. And perhaps very, very much impossible to achieve.
Completely
Considering,
impossible.
yeah,
Won't happen. Very hard. That's where we need to get to. We need to get to the point where we decouple farm welfare, which is important. Like, I'm all for farm subsidies. By all means, I am not a free trade person, right? I got past that dogma 20 years ago, right? I think we need to protect our markets. I think we need to protect our farmers. But delivering farm welfare needs to be decoupled from perverting input and output prices, which then influence decisions of farmers in ways that yield suboptimal outcomes, and in this case, environmental devastation.
Yeah, completely. I mean, there's, and yeah, I mean, I was hoping to also hear something from you on the climate change perspective, but maybe I'll just ask one more question and you can merge it if you feel like. My last question is that you've got exposure in both India and America in the ag tech investment space and perhaps a larger agricultural investment space. So how do you see, the commonalities and the differences? How do you see these two spaces? And of course, the climate change question is much larger in America, and that's also something I'd like to hear from you.
I mean, I think the climate mitigation story is much larger in America, but I actually think from a climate resilience adaptation story, India is the point of the spear, right? Like American farmers are farming, right, 2,000 hectare farms, right, from inside an air-conditioned cab in a large tractor with maybe 6 to 10 people working on that farm, right? It's entirely automated, and in that sense, much less vulnerable to climate change. Whereas I think Indian farming is actually very vulnerable to climate change, and we need to be prioritizing this issue much more than the Americans. I guess the question on how are things different, it's entirely different, right? India is a smallholder system of 13 crore farmers, right? So, and America has, full time about less than 1 million farmers. There's a lot of hobby farmers, people that essentially like, work in Chicago but live on a farm and commute into the city, and it's been in their family for a long time, but they're not living on that production agriculture, right? It's more of a family tradition, and in some cases, a source of wealth that is kept in the form of land, with very minimal amounts of taxation. So I would highly recommend a book by a journalist that I think very highly of, named Sarah Mock, called "Farm is an F Word." That kind of will give you a better sense of what American agriculture really is. But with respect to agritech, I think that there are very different solutions being worked on for smallholders in India than what exists and what is being developed for broadacre farmers in the US and Brazil and Australia and other places. But a lot of it are about the same themes: digitizing the farm, digitizing the supply chain, developing new and innovative inputs, developing new and innovative hardware. So that part's consistent, but the path to market is entirely different.
All right. Thanks a lot. Each one of the answers is really valuable. Thank you.
Highly recommend the book. Farm is an F word.
I'll just go buy it right away. I'll order it right away.
Farm is a 4-letter. It's either farm is an F word or farm is a 4-letter word, but it's by Sarah Mock.
Yeah, I'll just look it up on Amazon right away. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandeep, for such an insightful question. May I request Mr. Sushil Kumar to join in and ask his set of questions? Sir?
Yeah. Good evening, Mr. Mark.
Good evening, Sushil.
A number of agritech startups are taking birth in India. How do you see their future?
Well, I invest only in the sector, so I must think it's pretty good. Otherwise, I should change my job.
That's great. And Indian economy is driven by agriculture. And in recent times, agricultural exports from India are rising exponentially. How do you see agricultural exports from India in times to follow?
Look, I think India eventually could be doing, $100 billion to $150 billion of exports, and I think that would be a game changer. I think, again, I go back to the point that I made slightly earlier. For a long time, the Indian agricultural economy was essentially organized around the fact that we had a deficit in food production.
Yeah.
We do not have a deficit in food production. We haven't for almost 2 decades. We actually have a surplus. And that surplus is the same challenge that Europe faces. It's the same challenge that the US faces. It's what do we do with that surplus? How do we deal with that surplus? And I think that's what really gives policymakers a challenge, because they're so used to this green revolution mindset of grow more, grow more, grow more, which is not actually what we need to do right now. We need to figure out what to do with our surplus. And I think there are 3 things you can do with the surplus. One is you can process it, which is one thing we need to do. The second is you can export it. And the third is you can disintermediate value chains so that farmers sell more directly to the ultimate consumer and get more of a percentage of that consumer's rupee. And so I think all 3 are very important. But with respect to exports, I think there's a huge opportunity to radically accelerate what we export out of India. We export $1 billion of horticulture out of India.
Yeah.
That is, there's no other way to put it. It's pathetic. Okay, it's ridiculous. We export a couple $100 million of grapes from Maharashtra, and a couple $100 million of onions from Maharashtra, and a couple $200 million of gherkins from Karnataka, and basically some mangoes, and that's it. We could be doing $40, $50 billion of horticulture exports from India under drip irrigation, right, to consumers all over the world. But we don't. We're not yet. There's a huge opportunity to look at, agricultural exporting giants, right? Giants like Brazil, but also mid-sized success stories like Turkey, to kind of point to a path forward. I have never been a believer that the path, of India is to follow China and destroy the global environment by mindlessly exporting cheap consumer goods. I think that India needs to follow its own path in development, and that path needs to go through the farm. And being a giant in food processing and agricultural exports is a way to create rural employment. It's a way to drive value to farmers. And I think it's very important. And I hope that's the direction that we eventually head in.
That's great. Sir, just to be concluded with COP26, and now outcomes are globally known. How do you see these outcomes impact Indian agritech?
Look, I'm not sure. I think what COP26 will do is direct additional attention to climate mitigation and resilience strategies in India,
Yeah.
and hopefully direct additional funding into players that are working on those. And so I think that's going to be the most immediate effect from agritech, and that possibly there'll be an increasing amount of government support for addressing, maybe not so much the mitigation, because that's a more political issue, but at the very least, adaptation and resilience strategies.
That's great. Great. Thank you, Mr. Mark.
Thank you, Sushil, sir. We have two questions from our present viewers. Mr. Ashwini Kumar, how does macro picture of agriculture processing investment looks like for India, especially the hilly states? And how does CII engage with grassroots level agriculture sector, as wealth distribution and percolation down is not very efficient?
Yeah, let me be clear on the second point. I launched an initiative for agritech in CII. I'm also involved in the main Agri Council, which is largely agribusiness companies. But the purpose there was to get more grassroots players in front of policymakers and to get them a voice through CII. So yeah, I mean, I fully understand the second concern. On the first, with respect to food processing from hilly states, look, I think there's an opportunity for food processing in every district of India. I think what is ultimately produced is going to be a function of what is grown, right? If we think about whether it's Himachal or Uttarakhand or the Sikkim or the Northeast or JK or whatever, I think in general right now there's a tremendous underinvestment in food processing. And as a result, farmers don't get as much for their perishable and non-perishable goods as they could. And I think that we need to, be looking at modernizing our food processing capacity and creating, geographic indicators and protecting those brands. And, it sounds funny to say this, but like France does this really well, far better than America. There are many nations that have kind of figured out that it's important to build brands around the kind, regional, highly differentiated produce or products. And I think there's a good opportunity for India to do that. It's hard, but it's a great opportunity for SME entrepreneurship. This is not necessarily agritech, but I think these are great businesses that people can build. They are sustainable businesses. They can certainly scale nicely and be quite profitable. And I hope to see a great deal of this kind of entrepreneurship. I think it's I once joked with one of my Omnivore partners that my retirement would involve moving to Mizoram and setting up a food processing business there to exist in perpetuity. I think there's a great opportunity.
Wonderful, Mark. Thank you so much for the insights, valuable insights, and so much of wisdom that you shared with all of us, all our viewers, in such a short span of time.
It's a
We
pleasure.
highly appreciate. We highly appreciate your presence.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see the work that you guys are doing, and I wish everyone a very happy, coming holiday season, the last festive season just getting over, and thank you again. Take care.
Thank you, Mark. Take care.